Hello, everyone. My name is Raphael.
Hello.
I am the events coordinator at Berkeley Center for New Media, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event, Computing the News, Data Journalism, and the Search for Objectivity with Sylvain Parasie. The Berkeley Center for New Media, BCNM, is an interdisciplinary research center that studies and shapes media transition and emergence from diverse perspectives. Through critical thinking and making, we cultivate technological equity and fairness in our classrooms, in our communities, and on the internet. Our Commons conversations take place a few times each academic year. This is our lunchtime discussion series, largely focused on the impact of new media on our current political and public climate. These discussions typically happen in the BCNM Commons on campus with occasional online talks, as in today's case. I want to invite everyone to participate by responding to today's lecture in the chat or in the Q&A portion, and ask that attendees help us maintain an inclusive, respectful, and harassment-free space. Attendees who violate any of these guidelines will be removed from the event and may be disallowed from future online events. If you're new to our events, please take a moment to read our community agreements. We'll share a link to those in the chat in a moment. I would also like to take a moment to offer a land acknowledgement. We recognize that BCNM is located in the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone peoples, specifically the Confederated Villages of Lashan. The history of prolific technological development in this region, as in all regions, has always depended on the land. And all of our technological infrastructure and activities take place on and in relation to this land. We commit to supporting the sovereignty and ongoing stewardship of this place by Ohlone peoples through building long-term reciprocity and relationships with tribal leaders and organizations. We're, of course, thrilled by last month's news that the city of Berkeley has at long last returned the West Berkeley Shell Mound to Ohlone stewardship, care of the Sogorea-Te Land Trust. This is a significant victory in the broader land back movement, and we hope it's a harbinger of things to come throughout and beyond the Bay Area. Now to introduce this afternoon's speaker. Sylvain Parasie is a professor of sociology at Sciences Po in Paris and director of Sciences Po's Media Lab. Parasie received his PhD in sociology from the École Normale Supérieure de Cachan and holds an agrégation in social sciences and economics. His research explores the interplay between technology, news organizations, and democracy based on qualitative and computational methods. He has conducted fieldwork in the US and France on legal regulations of the media, digital innovation in news organizations, and the emerging relationship between journalism and computer science. A bit about today's talk before I hand it over to Professor Parasie. Faced with a full-blown crisis, a growing number of journalists are engaging in seemingly unjournalistic practices, such as creating and maintaining databases, handling algorithms, or designing online applications. Data journalists claim that these approaches help the profession demonstrate greater objectivity and fulfill its democratic mission. In their view, computational methods enable journalists to better inform their readers, more closely monitor those in power, and offer deeper analysis. In his book, Computing the News, Sylvain Parasie examines how data journalists and news organizations have navigated the tensions between traditional journalistic values and new technologies. He traces the history of journalistic hopes for computing technology and contextualizes the surge of data journalism in the 21st century. By importing computational techniques and ways of knowing new to journalism, news organizations have come to depend on a broader array of human and non-human actors. Professor Parasie draws on extensive fieldwork in the US and France, including interviews with journalists and data scientists, as well as a behind-the-scenes look at several acclaimed projects in both countries. Ultimately, he argues fulfilling the promise of data journalism requires the renewal of journalistic standards and ethics. Offering an in-depth analysis of how computing has become part of the daily practice of journalists, His book proposes ways for journalism to evolve in order to serve democratic societies. Please join me in welcoming Sylvain Parasie.
Thank you so much for the great introduction, Raphael. Very nice to meet you all. I will share my slides right now. I hope this works. Yes, is it okay? So I would like also to start with thanking you, Raphael, but also Lara Vol for the invitation, and also Abigail de Kosnik for inviting me to present my book. So I'm, as you said, I'm a French sociologist working in Paris at Sciences Po. I have a great colleague, Jen Schradier, who is so a great colleague of mine at Sciences Po, and she often talked to me about the Berkeley Center for New Media. So I'm delighted to be here today. Computing the News is my second book, my first book in English, and it all started 14 years ago with a fieldwork in Chicago with a very, very good friend and colleague of mine, Eric Dagiral, and we discovered there a vibrant scene where computer programmers, activists, and journalists were trying to develop news production practices relying on data infrastructures, statistics, and web development. So I became interested in data journalism. This expression appeared around 2010 in Great Britain originally, but the phenomenon was much older in the United States, and it quickly became an international phenomenon. And you know that perfectly at the University of California in Berkeley, because the Sigma Award was given recently to a former student of UC Berkeley School of Journalism, who carried out a very impressive investigation on thousands of people assassinated by the police, notably in Bangladesh, by building a database thanks to the work of human rights activists. So what I found very interesting from the outset was the fact that data journalism was a grassroots and is a grassroots movement. It's not the management trying to impose computational practices, nor technologists wanting to modernize the journalistic craft. It was journalists with diverse backgrounds who believed that the growing availability of data and computational resources might allow the whole profession to better fulfill its mission. And one of the core arguments was that of the movement was that computational skills, broadly speaking, statistic, web development, database management, should be recognized as full-fledged journalism, and that computational practitioners and experts should be treated equally within newsrooms. And for the whole profession, we could say that data journalism and the use of computational resources has been associated with positive democratic outcomes. To put it briefly, it would enable, that's the premise, it would enable journalists first to help people make better informed decisions, or to supervise those in power more effectively, and to provide a more systematic understanding of society and the environment. So there's three first premises are not new, but the last one is newer and covering events and people long excluded from media coverage. That's also something very important, a very important premise. I will get to that later. So what was very new with this trend and this with data journalism was the high level of hope put in technology, because technology was supposed to reinforce the journalistic claim for objectivity. This hope in technology was very striking for me the first time I started fieldwork in Chicago many years from now. It is especially striking at times where the news industry struggles, partly because of the growing role of tech companies. So data journalism can be seen as a response to the major crisis faced by the news industry. Not surprisingly, this hope has generated setbacks and criticisms. The claim to greater objectivity has seduced many journalists critical of the importance given to anecdotes. But as we know, objectivity has been widely criticized in the profession, especially in the US, as a journalistic ideal. Critics and journalists realized that covering the news with statistics, data applications, did not protect them from bias. So in this book, my goal was to take the question of data journalism's democratic contribution seriously. I didn't want to discard this news production practices as some kind of scientific varnish, but I didn't want either to consider them systematically favorable to journalism's contribution to democracy. So especially that kind of journalism was harshly criticized over the years. And so that kind of social science perspective was very interesting for me, but I wanted to take data journalism more seriously. So to answer, in this book, I would say that my goal was to study, and my research strategy was to analyze change in journalistic ethics. So the basic assumption I made was that when news professionals adopt computational practices to produce the news, the division of labor in news production is changing. That is to say, for instance, their relationships with their sources, their colleagues, and the audience are fundamentally altered. So this is why, as a result, news professionals face new questions that are both epistemological and ethical, such as, for instance, how can data and algorithms be harnessed to produce novel and authoritative revelations about the world? What are the ways of organizing work that result in significant contributions to the public debate? How can computational means be used to raise citizens' awareness of a problem and mobilize them to address it? So many questions. I wanted to describe and explain how the adoption of computational practices challenges the epistemologies and ethical norms of news professionals. So I try to account for how news professionals and organizations have dealt with that, but also have invented new norms, new standards based on that kind of theoretical backgrounds, for instance, sociology of epistemologies and pragmatic sociology. So in other words, my goal was to analyze and to explore how news professionals and news organizations are dealing with navigating through the tensions, ethical tensions brought about by that kind of computational practices. So I did my empirical research in the US and France. These two countries are very different, but they have a long-standing interest in the production of statistics. There are obviously important differences. For instance, the job market for data journalism that is significantly larger in the US compared to France. And the whole idea that computing practices might be good for journalists is much older and much more established in the US than in France. So I used various methods: interviews, historical documentation, ethnography, and digital methods. So I will try to provide some example and some insight into my research today. But as you can see in this graph, I try to compute and to calculate the ratio of percentages in the New York Times and Le Monde in France. And so you can see that, I mean, there are not striking differences in the two news organizations, though there are some similarities between the two countries. So what is interesting, I think, in this book, I would like maybe to put it briefly, the book's main argument. My research actually shows that journalism and more generally democratic societies can benefit from the adoption of computational practices within news organizations, but only if journalists adjust their professional ethics. And this can be achieved by several means. Just for example, adopting organizational forms that maintain collective vigilance over data and calculations, building balanced relationships with computational experts and practitioners, developing a set of practices to enable users to become aware and discuss the systemic dimension of issues. As I shall explain later, this is particularly important today with the boom of generative AI. I think data journalism has valuable lessons for the present times. And especially, I would add also that the social sciences can also bring more reflexivity by making visible the moral and epistemological creativity showed by many journalists on both sides of the Atlantic. So here is the content of the book. And so just to, yes, we have 8 chapters, and I would like maybe to dive in one of the first historical chapter. The first chapter, for instance, focuses on a movement that emerged in the US starting in the late 60s. A handful of journalists came to envision computers. Computers obviously were not personal at that time, and they envisioned also the data themselves in the form of punch cards and magnetic tapes after that. And also they considered statistical computation and mostly quantitative social sciences as means of restoring journalistic authority. And so just to give you an example of those prominent figures, pioneers, to say, Philip Meyer and David Burnham are well-known pioneers of a movement that mostly grew in the 90s with the National Institute for Computer-Assisted Reporting. So it was primarily at the time investigative reporters who got organized. They exchange ideas and share their experiences with computers and databases. Some of them made new computer devices like Elliot Jaspin, the founder of Nikar, who built and sold this personal computer with a device to read magnetic tapes from the administration. So it was kind of innovative and kind of odd also to see a journalist selling computers. So they tried, those computer-assisted reporters, they tried collectively to answer some of the questions I raised earlier, and through intern documentation, through handbooks, conferences, seminars, etc., they tried to answer that type of questions. For instance, how practically can we get data from governments? How do we ensure data quality? How do we make sense of the data? How can we collaborate with other journalists and experts? How do we cope with the organization's limited resources? And how is it possible to provide the public with readable and compelling editorial products? And so, studying all of this, I discovered that, and it was very striking for me to see how those pioneer journalists have tried to preserve journalistic standards and to protect themselves from believing too much in the power of technology. And so they design 4 primary rules. The first one being, don't let the data drive the story. Very odd to us today, but the idea back then was that their claim was that reporters must start with a story ID derived from tips or for human traditional sources. So it won't be such a good idea for them to start with the data themselves. A second rule was that government databases are inherently dirty, means that reporters must expect officials or public databases to be full of mistakes, full of errors. Also that trends in the data have a real journalistic value, but not the data, the scattered data themselves. This is where quantitative social sciences comes in. Granular data at the time were considered as having no journalistic value per se. The journalistic value comes from the statistical computations, calculations. Just to give you an example of that, in the early 1990s, Steve Doyle won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting, performing statistical regression in order to show that the homes hardest hit by Hurricane Andrew in Florida in 1992 were not those that experienced the most intense wind speeds, but rather those that were built without respecting construction standards. So it was very important at that time for those journalists. And also, lastly, for them, it is not useful for them, for the readers, to access the data. It's very odd for us today, but statistical analysis for those computer-assisted journalists should be seen as the foundation of a building. So therefore, readers don't have to know all the data and the statistical apparatus behind the story. So it was very, very interesting how hard those journalists tried, to preserve their kind of journalistic autonomy and journalistic standard, and again, to protect themselves from believing too much in the power of technology. A very different tradition is explored in chapter 2, very different from the heroic history of computer assisting reporting in the US. There has been a much less prestigious set of computational news practices, and not only in the US, but also in Europe and in France at the same time, almost at the same time. Computational journalistic rankings, especially the computational rankings that emerged in the late 80s. So like Philip Meyer or David Burnham, those computational rankers, they had this initial intention to better contribute to democracy. So for the first practitioners, both in the US and in France, computing ranking was a way to increase scrutiny over education and health institutions. So they wanted to empower citizens, which they did to some extent. They also wanted to contribute to the adoption of new policies in health and education. So at the time, and this is an example of the well-known educational rankings, college ranking from US News and World Report, but basically you had the exact similar computational rankings in France, especially for hospitals and health institutions at the time. So at the time, those product journalistic outputs were kind of popular. I mean, the commercial element of it was very good for most media outlets at the time. But at the same time, those journalists experienced huge and very important critics. They were widely criticized, and they experienced many difficulties. For instance, they had to resist, and they found it very difficult to resist the strategies of institutions to appear better in the rankings, and they tended also to favor the wealthiest institutions. But by contrast with computer-assisted reporters, they didn't manage to get organized collectively and to build collective norms to cope with the consequences of their calculations. And eventually, professional journalists lost control over the productions of that kind of ranking. So I think this is a valuable lesson for today. The difficulty experienced by computational rankers at the time, it should serve as a reminder that computation alone cannot guarantee more transparent institutions and better informed citizens. As journalists engage in computational practices, even ones driven by a commitment to democratization, they remain accountable for the undesirable effects of their calculations. So let's return to the norms built by the computer-assisted reporting movements. Based on that, we can see what has changed with the web, and more recently, all the changes in infrastructure, in the profession, and in social movements related to digital technology have profoundly impacted the way journalists interact with computational technology. What has changed dramatically is the cultural and political significance of data and computation. So just to give you an example of that, it's obvious for many of us that, okay, you can tell a story being a journalist, as a journalist, you can tell a story that is data-driven, okay? Government databases are supposed to allow tracking of government's actions in relation to the open data and open government advocacy. Also, it's supposed that granular data is much more valuable than aggregated data. It's a strong difference with what was originally imagined and envisioned by the computer-assisted reporting movement. People should also have access to the data. That's something many people believe in, and that's perfectly normal. In connection with, again, open government activism, advocacy, the rise of data science and web development. So the question is now, okay, for those who gathered into a new professional segment, many different countries, not only in the US and in France, many very different countries across the world. Those people have very different profiles and skills, and they face very important questions. How do they deal with this new epistemological configuration? And so social science for most data journalists is not something very important, or not as important as it used to be with the computer-assisted reporting movement. And so they still today would like to take advantage of their skills to find their way in a tough job market. So the question here is that, okay, the promises, the fact that, okay, it was supposed that relying on computational practices would, allow journalists to better fulfill their democratic mission. The whole thing has fueled huge controversy within the profession, mostly in the US, but also in other countries. It's very important, that kind of discussions and controversy I analyze in the book. Just to give you an example of that, okay, the fact that, okay, this motto, get back to the facts using databases and computational practices, it has been very important for the whole movement. But, you know, many journalists across the world and in news organizations have experienced the fact that, okay, the data don't speak for themselves. It's always kind of difficult to make data speak. Also, the data, okay, doesn't go along, don't go along with an increased transparency, because the data in itself are also political, because they are based on, you know, choices, political choices. They are often tied to administrations and public policy and everything. So they are political, and it's quite. It's not, I mean, dumping data or providing the public with databases is not enough. Okay, it's what is kind of important is to allow people to connect the dots, or to be aware of the more general issue behind the data. So in order to investigate and to explore the emerging ethics of journalism, I focused on several outstanding projects. Okay, I selected those projects in France and in the US mostly because they were, you know, acclaimed by the professions, and so I found them very important, because each of those projects focus on a specific aspect of the journalistic ethics that is being challenged by computational practices. And so, for instance, the kind of questions that are raised by those very interesting projects. How do we ensure that the data are unbiased and capture some degree of reality? That's connected to chapter 6, the making of a revelation. And also, so I will say a few words about this chapter, and also the chapter 8, the last chapter, who is focusing on a very different project, which raised a very important question related to how to bring about publics with data, and especially when journalists give up selecting the events that deserve to be covered. So the first project I would like to say a few words about is a project that was called On Shaky Ground. It's so I did some ethnography. I interviewed journalists in California, and more specifically in San Francisco and Berkeley. My point was to analyze the making of a revelation by a specific organization based in Berkeley and San Francisco, the California branch of the Center for Investigative Reporting. This investigation was carried out in the early 2010s, so it revealed the systemic failure in the enforcement of seismic safety standards in California public schools. And so it was kind of impactful investigation at the time, because the journalists involved wanted to process and to collect vast amounts of data, and also at the same time they wanted to use computational practices and technology in order to provide with the readers with tools in order to be fully aware of the seismic risks in California. And so it also was important. So they at the very beginning of this project, the journalists and the data analysts had a mission. They wanted to harness the power of data. And so the purpose was to design a news application showing every parent how risky their children's schools was at the time. And so they tried, to provide citizens with that kind of interactive map, showing in red, okay, the seismic risky zone, and showing all with dots all the building, the educational public schools in California. And at the very beginning, it was a mess. From the outset, the team faced major obstacles and huge tension because, the data were very messy and full of errors. And, as Agustin explained to me back then, the data analyst behind the story, he told me, okay, databases are just observations. Okay, sometimes it tells you more about the observer than it does about the actual thing being observed, which sound like a very sociological insight, because the very difficult thing he experienced back then was that the DSA, the Division of the State Architect, was experiencing major problems back then, and so the quality of the data of its database was very poor, and the data was full of mistakes, full of errors, and so making or using that kind of data in order to make a journalistic revelation was very hard for the whole team. And so a conflict appeared within the team about what to do with the data. Can we really rely on those data? How high is the risk of conveying false information to parents? And what is very interesting is that, in the end, eventually the team managed to make a revelation based on the data. It was acclaimed by the whole profession and even generated hearings at the California State Congress. And so, it takes much time because the investigation lasted 19 months and was very costly. But eventually, it was a success. And what interested me at the time was the reason for this success. And I argue that the main reason is about organization. The team found ways to organize the collective work in a way that maintains some collective vigilance over the political constructed nature of the data. They found ways, to remain critical to data and algorithms. So, practically speaking, they found three norms that are very critical, very important. The first one being to limit the division of work on the data. They found it quite dangerous to think of data work as a series of isolated operations carried out by specialized workers and cut off from the rest of the organizations. And so I think it's something very important. Too much division of labor raised the risk of it for each journalist to take for granted the work of their colleagues and to lose the whole picture and to lose the reality behind the data. They also designed a second rule related to the combination of ways of knowing. Especially, they have succeeded, in to articulate, to combine in a way the qualitative analysis of documents and the data analysis. So the database was not only a way to collect and to generate knowledge, but also a means of distributing the organization's resources more efficiently. And so, you had traditional investigative reporters, collecting tons of documents, etc. And you had at the same time data analysts, they have found a collective organization trying to combine those different ways of knowing. And lastly, I would say that they have managed to embed ethical considerations into technology. More specifically, the problem at the time was for the team involved was that, it was practically impossible to make accurate measurements of the school's distance from seismic zone. So it was very difficult for the reporters and the data analysts to be very sure of this accuracy of measurements. And so they had some ethical concerns because, their goal was also to provide responsible information to parents, basically. And so their fear was to raise unfounded fears, and not to be responsible enough. And so the practical solution and the very innovative solution they have found is to design some buffer, okay, in order not to represent each building as a dot, but as a circle, something wider, something larger, in order to alert parents and to make them know that there may be a risk in their children's schools. So I think, again, it's very important to insist on the innovation those data journalists have found in setting new organizational standards. Lastly, the last chapter on this book is about a very different project. This long-standing project was, implemented by the Los Angeles Times, and it embodies one major promise of data journalism, and very important promise to remedy the undercoverage of minorities in the media. And so this project was launched in 2010, and its purpose at the time was to provide an exhaustive and comprehensive and standardized coverage of every homicide committed in Los Angeles County. And so, yes, such a project raised a major question for the ethics of data journalism. How is it possible to get people aware and organized about such a major issue when they are allowed to select only the homicides that interest them? In other words, journalists were kind of giving up selecting the events that deserve to be covered, okay, which is traditional with the gatekeeping role of news professionals and journalists. And so, yes, the question here was, is it possible, how is it possible for journalists and data journalists to bring about publics on the basis of data? So it was basically, this project consisted of an interactive map, with all the dots corresponding to a specific homicide in the Los Angeles County. And so this project, objectivity was key to the project, or more specifically, I would say factuality was very important. As the editor Megan Garvey explained at the time, it was very important because the whole purpose for this project was to make visible the real people who are getting killed day in, day out. Well, most very often 17 to 22-year-old Black male living in a poor neighborhood. And those are not covered most of the time in legacy media and mainstream media. So it was very important to find a way and to use for Megan Garvey and all the journalists involved to set up or to use computational practices and technology in order to remedy this huge problem. And so with a computational social scientist, a very good colleague of mine, Jean-Philippe Pointet, we tried to scrap the data, to collect the data from the website in order to analyze how people engage with the platform. And so it was kind of, we tried to use computational methods as well as journalists were using them in the first place. And so using also supervised text classification, our goal was to, to sociologically analyze the public and the reception of homicides news on the platform. So one of the first thing we observed was that people on the platform on the homicide report they comment mostly on homicides involving minorities, which is in a contrast with what was done traditionally in the printed edition of the Los Angeles Times. And so it was very important also, not only the minorities, but also when officers are involved in the homicide. I mean, it generated a more important, a larger number of comments on the platform. So it was kind of a first thing that was interesting in this study. And we managed, to identify two main collectives that were, involved in the reception of homicides of the platform. The first, I named the first a collective of inquiry. Basically, I mean by that a group of people who commented on a great deal of different homicides. So they are basically, people who are engaging with a high number of homicides, and also often they also engage in heated discussions about institutions, the police, etc. Okay, so most of them are a clear political agenda, just like Eye Opener you see here. So they have a clear agenda, and they try to make their case, they make their arguments on the basis of each homicide. We have also a very different publics, which is the loving relatives. And this public is totally different. Those people have personal ties with the deceased. Like you can see, the author-victim relationship is very strong. Okay, you can see it through the text. So they have strong personal ties with the deceased, with the victim, and they often comment only on one homicide. And so most of the time, they emphasize the moral qualities of the deceased. And sometimes what we can see in the data and the data analysis is that, when the homicide is, also engage a police officer. When a police officer is involved in the homicide, only the civic-oriented considerations are much more frequent in that case. And so the type of discussion evolved very, very importantly. And so what is interesting here is that the Los Angeles Times journalists, I mean, they managed eventually, to brought about those two publics. And they managed to do this not because of the data infrastructure itself, but because they set up an original moderation policy that was very original at the time. To put it briefly, they wanted the two publics to interact, okay, on the homicides and on the when they commented on the homicides. And so yes, they wanted to make those two publics interact. And so they produced maps and articles in order to make readers see the fuller picture, okay, the broader pattern in the data. And so what was very critical here was, the kind of editorial decisions they make based on the data, but not only on the data itself. They and that was very interesting. The fact that those journalists managed to find ways in order to bring about those publics. And actually, in order to conclude my presentation today, I would say that we could draw, and I would like to draw a few lessons for today, especially today with the boom of generative AI. Generative AI is a major concern for the news industry and for journalism, and I think it's worth remembering the lessons of the few lessons of data journalism I try to present and analyze in this book. First, the thing that computing has been a component of journalistic activity for decades, or for some journalists. But this, and especially with data journalism, they had a certain skepticism about opaque industry design computing technologies, and so it's very important to keep in mind that technology is often very interesting, but some sort of low scales technology, or technology that could be interpreted or made sense of at a low level. Of course, generative AI services are very interesting. They can save time, but most of the most important tasks cannot be fully automated. And as we saw earlier, I mean, verifying information is very costly. Bringing out publics is something difficult, and it cannot be fully automated. And so it's very important for news organizations and journalists to be fully aware of that. And another very important lesson I think for today is that the use of computation in journalism, require significant resource. Not only technological resources, but also human resources, and it is likely to generate inequalities between news organizations. So I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Parasie. This was a great talk, super informative, obviously super timely. We've got some great questions coming in the Q&A. I want to encourage people who are on to add any that you maybe are sitting on or you're thinking of in the moment. And we'll certainly pose those. We've got about half an hour or so here. I'm going to start just with something towards the end. You mentioned generative AI, and obviously this is a fairly new phenomenon, at least in terms of public engagement with it. We've had a few events just this semester addressing generative AI. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about how news organizations that you've been in contact with, have witnessed, have studied, are dealing with the practical and ethical complexities of generative AI right now. You mentioned, obviously, you can't rely on it for aggregating, analyzing, but it does seem like it is a shortcut in many ways for folks, and this is, I think, in the news world and beyond. How are, in what you've studied, what you've seen, how are news organizations approaching generative AI, approaching the ethics around it, approaching how to best utilize it without over-relying on it, I guess would be what I'm thinking.
Yeah, thank you, Raphael. That's a very good question, a very important question nowadays. I would say that yes, generative AI has so many different applications. But I think what is very interesting right now is the fact that I see, especially in Europe, I would say, I see, news organizations and journalists, in very different organizations, trying to set up some ethical charts, ethical guidelines, and to try to take sometimes, to reflect and to set up some standards. And I think it's very important, very, very interesting, because, especially I saw this in France, because it's very rare in France that to see, journalists in very different user organizations taking time to set up some standards. I mean, it's very rare, and it's been the first time, especially with the organization that is called Reporters Without Borders. And it's very interesting, and I would say that there is a strong, especially in Europe, because we have the European Union being very keen on setting up new regulations, and I think it has driven some reflection, very important reflection in the journalistic community. So it's very interesting. I at the same time, I think that what is very difficult with generative AI, is the kind of discussion, or also power relations between grassroots reporters, journalists, okay, news professionals, and executives, technology experts, and all the people who would like to modernize the journalistic craft. I think we see some tensions, very important tensions going on, especially regarding, I would say, commercial, what we call sometimes, the platformizations of news. That is more specifically the fact that generative AI can be used to follow what are the preferences of the readers on social media, etc., and to automatically provide them with the content they would like to see and to read. And I think it's the most important things going on. We have so many issues, so many tension, and so many questions going on right now.
Great. Thank you for that. So let me dip into the Q&A over here.
Sure.
Around a little bit. I'll start with a comment that I think leads into it, a question. One attendee said, basically, the new tech world needs to hold journalism outlets and other spokespeople for truth accountable. There needs to be a jury or moderator offering a ranked scale of quality of information and conclusions. To be blunt, we need a BS meter these days. This could be both for the written as well as the spoken word. It could be presented as gentle, not obnoxious. Obviously, the purpose is to avoid manipulation of data and truths. So that's a comment. And I think this follow-up question links well. Who ought to be responsible, in your opinion, about improving the interconnectedness of databases maintained by different state agencies? And in parentheses, I'm thinking about California and its various public data sets that aren't easy to query in a single place to answer simple questions.
You're right. I mean, it's very, very interesting, and there are so many issues there. But what is very, very key? I mean, there are different things. I mean, the maybe one aspect is the quality of data, and especially the quality of data coming from the administration and governments. It's an issue. It's an issue, especially, I mean, very differently put in Europe and in the US, I would say. For instance, traditionally in France, we used to, I mean, it was very difficult for journalists to get the data, and it still is very difficult for French journalists to get access to the data, and especially for many reasons. But one very striking difference between France and the US is, for example, the privacy laws, because in France, privacy laws are much more important compared to the US, and so in the data themselves, I mean, everything that relates to individuals has to be redacted or erased, and so it makes a huge difference. It's very difficult for French journalists to get access to quality data. But I'd say you're totally right. What is really important, I would say, is that it's not enough to have access to the data. for journalists and news organizations. I think what is very important is to have, some sort of ecology, okay, many different actors, trying to vet or trying to verify or to uh, enrich the data also. And I think it's very important to rely on, non-profit actors, foundations, organizations, activists also sometimes. And it's very important to build that kind of collaborations between news organizations, news professionals, and that sort of actors who are some kind of, and it's very important to have that kind of intermediary actors, between governments and news organizations. But you're right. I mean, it's very difficult. I think, when I started working on this book, we were in 2010, decades ago, and at the time, the whole tone was much more optimistic. I mean, the whole expectation around data algorithms. I mean, people not only in the academia but also journalists and the wider public. I mean, people were much more optimistic. And nowadays it's totally different. I mean, we have. I mean, the skepticism in technology is much wider. What is also very important is the fact that, okay, we have collectively, we have understood that it's not because you have the data that you have the truth. I mean, you don't have knowledge. I mean, you have to enrich, you have to verify, you have to do all sorts of things on with the data. And I mean, it's resource intensive, and it's not accessible to any newsroom or to any new citizen or news professional. So it's very important. And what is also very important, it's that, especially with the US, I would say, is when we first heard of data journalism, or even in the 1990s in the US with computer-assisted reporting, at the time, there was a strong belief that, it would provide with knowledge, more solid knowledge. But nowadays, I mean, just polarization is so important in the US that it's very difficult to say that conflicts can be solved through the data. It seems very optimistic and naive to argue that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the comments and questions we're receiving speak to that skepticism that you named well. And here's another one that builds on this quite a bit. Hi, Professor Parasie. Thank you for joining us today. I'm a master's candidate at the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. I work with incarcerated individuals, and I'm currently pursuing research around demographic data on race and discrimination in accordance with the new Racial Justice Act of 2020 in California. The data we work with is inherently reflective of strongly biased and subjective realities, as you can imagine, as you've been speaking to, which perhaps counters the predominant narrative/critique that journalism is where subjectivity arises in the data journalism pipeline. What are your thoughts, if you've touched on this a bit, but maybe a little more, what are your thoughts on the perceptional gap between subjective data and objective reporting, or perhaps the difference in assumption that data is objective where reporting is not? How can this shift?
You're right. It's very, very interesting. And that kind of project is fascinating. So I would love to read more about this project. I think it's very fascinating. You're totally right. And I touch on this in this book a little. You're right. The fact that, okay, government data, they they are inherently biased, or to be more specific, I would say that they show, or they bear the testimony of political choices, and that's totally normal. It couldn't be otherwise. So that's totally normal. And I think what is important for the journalistic practice is, to constantly remain, critical or skeptical, about the data in order also at some point, just to give you, I talked a little bit about the seismic safety in California, and the map I was showing to you earlier. I mean, the whole map at some point of the investigation, the reporters involved, they used to talk to people specializing in those risks, in the seismic risk in California, and basically they learned that the whole map was political. Okay, because the high risk zone was designed over the years. Okay, and to enable promoters, real estate people, okay, to build on this zone. I mean, the whole zone was reduced over time. Okay, and so it was in itself highly political, and I think it's very critical for journalists to remain aware of that, and also to use qualitative means and the craft that they have traditionally to explain basically why the data in the first place are biased. I mean, it's so important to remain conscious of that. It's the main difference between data science in a way. I mean, there are some data scientists being very critical of the data quality, but I think it's very important for journalists to remain that and to tell the story of how the data is biased in the first place.
Great. Let's talk a little bit. You brought up the map, several of the maps. Let's talk a little bit about data visualization. We have a couple of questions and related to that. Can you say more about the role of data visualization in particular in shaping how data journalism can enact change in readers/viewers' relationship to the news? And let me just tag on another one that's in the same realm. How are different organizations approaching the issue of effective data visualization? It seems like this is an area that newsrooms might not have traditionally focused on due to the emphasis on text, but how to present data insights accurately and effectively seems, I would add, increasingly it's a critical one. Maybe you can touch on those issues.
Yeah, sure, with pleasure. It's very, very important, very interesting, and you're right. I mean, data visualization is very critical, very important, and in itself also bears some political choices. Because basically at the very first time when the first data journalists, in the 2010 or so, the last decade, I mean, the first of them, most of them were, using the data and creating some mashups with Google Maps also, and so putting the data on the map. The job was not done at all for readers, because it's very important and very interesting for readers and for people to see themselves in the news stories, or to see precisely a dot, okay, something that is very close to their their neighborhood or etc., their personal life. I think it's quite important. But what is very important is to enable basically readers to zoom out, and that's very difficult to be able to zoom out, because as readers, our reflex is much more to zoom in, okay, to see where I am. I mean, in the old news story. I mean, it's very important to find ways in order to engage readers. And I think what is the most interesting, I would say, is the creativity and all the tricks journalists in the last decades have found, in order to represent the data and to make sure that readers find ways to see what is the general pattern, through the data, and even more granular data. And I think the balance between the granular and the more aggregated data is the most critical for journalists and news organizations, and it's I mean, there are also some practical problems, because designing engaging data visualization requires time, and so it's very difficult to make this fit into the old organizations and the pace of the news organization. It's quite difficult, and sometimes it's not fully. I mean, we still have some progress to do in that area, I would say, but you're right. I mean, it's something very, very interesting and very, very political at some point, especially with the smartphones and all the possibilities we have nowadays. But still, I would say that yes, the balance between the collective and the granular is the most challenging right now.
Yeah. Great. Let me poke around a little. We have a couple comments inevitably just around the notions of media and democracy and how this panel is connected to that. You've been touching on that implicitly, explicitly. I want to go up to one of the early questions around journalistic rankings. And someone asked, why are they harmful? Ranking journalism on factual and editorial fact verification and reporting standards seems the only credible manner of separating reliable information from unreliable information. I guess it begs the question of whether journalistic rankings can be seen as objective or whether they're prone to some of the same biases that you've been giving voice to in terms of how people interpret data that they're taking. Maybe you can speak a little to journalistic rank.
Sure. With pleasure. No, that's a great question. And it gives me the opportunity to elaborate a little bit on that. It's very important, you're right. I think what is, I totally agree. Fact verification is very important. I totally agree. But when you do some computational ranking, what is key, what is critical is the algorithm, basically the statistical model you rely on in order to produce the rankings. And so you have the quality of the data. That's one problem, one issue that is not very easy for journalistic rankings, because I mean, you have professionals in universities or in health, in hospitals, etc. I mean, their daily job is also to produce the data that will be eventually processed for the rankings. Okay, so so we always might fear some manipulation or some data practices that are messaging, you could say. So that's one issue. But I would say that another issue is the statistical model by itself. So the problem is that it's not only epistemological, but it's also political. Just to give you an example of that, when you have a statistical model, I mean that it's designed to rank universities, for instance, you can decide, to weight each of the variables differently, okay, and at some point it will, favor some institutions over other institutions. Okay, so it's highly political, and it's quite difficult to find the most appropriate or the most legitimate way of finding the good weight, the good statistical weight, or the good statistical model. And so some rankings can be harmful because they can systematically disadvantage some institutions. I mean, that's for sure. Just to give you an example of that, what is very key in those rankings is what we call the added value. The added value, it's very interesting because it's a way of, saying that, okay, you are this prestigious university, for instance, you are used to get the smartest students in your university. Okay, so I mean, you are expected to do well, and each student or most of the students will be graduated with good grades and everything. Okay, but the added value is that if you consider statistically, the level of the students, okay, you are expected to do better, and so you can compare between institutions and college, based on not paying attention to the level, the actual level of the students coming in your institution. So that's very interesting. You can find ways. So there are some statistical models that are less harmful than others. But I would say the classic sociological arguments is the effects of the rankings themselves. The fact that if you are poorly graded 1 year, it will be more difficult for you to improve the rankings over the years, though, because you will get less good students and everything. And so it's I think what is important is that I mean, most of the time computational rankings, they are not considered as pioneering data journalism, because most of the time they are discarded or disregarded. They are not well regarded by journalists most of the time. But I think it's very interesting to pay attention to this very interesting history.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, I think we're winding down. I think I'm going to offer one more question, and in part because you've just touched on universities, and we're obviously operating in a university context
Sure.
here. Journalism schools, we had a question about them and how they can remain relevant in this age. Don't they need to develop some kind of hook to stay relevant? And is the hook going to be data journalism now, data journalism in quotes? Maybe just speaking broadly to how you see schools of journalism adapting to data journalism and engaging with the field, and how you might advise them to do so to best prepare emerging journalists to be effective in the field going forward.
That's a great question. I would say that, over the last years, many journalism schools in the world, in the US, of course, but also in Europe, they have designed new programs, in data journalism, and I think it's very interesting. It's very interesting, especially because I think it provides a way to cope with all the new technological challenges that are to come, and especially generative AI, for instance. I think it's very important to have that. And also, I would say that sometimes it's very interesting to pay attention to. That would be my. I'm not. I'm a little. I must confess, I'm a little biased in this field. But social sciences are very important. I think they are important, especially because they provide with a critical perspective on technology, and also they provide journalists. They can provide journalists with ways of working with the data on a daily basis. And so I think it's very important to invest in the social sciences, or to develop bridges between social sciences and journalism. And so that's very key. But my concern, I would say nowadays, is that, the fact that the job market is so difficult for journalists right now, obviously in the US, but it's less harsh compared to the US in France nowadays, but it's still it's very pretty tough. And what is very a concern for me is the fact that with generative AI, the problem is that journalists may lack some, or yes, may suffer from all the kind of generative AI technology that would prevent them to remain autonomous. Their journalistic professional autonomy is threatened in a way by generative AI, and that's a concern for me. I think it's very important to again, I mean, to remember the lessons of data journalism, because data journalism offers, in a way, to remain critical and to make sense of the data and digital technology in a constructive way for journalists, I think.
Great. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. Professor Parasie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation and the great questions and the discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you to our attendees. This was a robust Q&A. Much appreciated for everyone who joined us.
Thank you all.